The wind howls through the mountains, its icy fingers clawing at anything in its path. But inside John McCallister's cabin, the fire crackles, untouched by the raging blizzard outside. He's built his life in this unforgiving land, and now his greatest creation may be the only thing standing between him and death. But can his impossible chimney survive the storm of the century? Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're captivated by tales of survival like this, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will take you even further into the wild, with a story even more unbelievable than this one. The first gusts of wind came down from the mountainside just before sundown. They were cold, biting, and relentless, the unmistakable warning that winter had arrived with a vengeance. John McCallister, standing at the cabin door, watched as snow began to swirl through the trees, each flake like a tiny dagger against the night. He had seen many storms in his years on the frontier, but there was something different about this one. It felt as if the mountain itself had woken up and was determined to show him its full fury. He pulled his thick coat tighter around his shoulders and stepped back inside, the warmth of the hearth enveloping him. The fire was burning hot, as always, but tonight it was more than just a comfort, it was a necessity. The chimney, a rare and almost forgotten design in these parts, had never failed him, and he would need it now more than ever. His cabin, built with care and purpose, had kept him safe through the brutal winters before, but this storm was different. He had heard the old trappers talk about the blizzards that could break even the strongest of shelters, the ones that seemed to go on forever. With a deep breath, John moved to the stove and stoked the fire, the flames licking the iron as if eager to burn brighter. The chimney, crafted by his own hands, stood proudly above the hearth, its stone structure solid and reliable. Most men built simple flues or used crude stone stacks, but John had something different in mind. He had built this chimney with the specific intention of surviving the harshest of winters. Little did he know, this storm would put his creation to the test in ways he could never have predicted. Outside, the wind howled louder, the snow now falling in thick sheets, but inside, the fire burned steady. John sat down at the small wooden table near the window, the glow of the flames casting long shadows on the walls. He watched as the snow piled higher outside, each flake an omen of the struggle to come. The storm would be here for days, maybe longer. His eyes fell on the chimney again, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of doubt. Had he done enough? Was his chimney truly as secure as he believed? Or was he simply fooling himself into thinking his little piece of engineering could stand up to nature's wrath? The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, John found comfort in the steady crackling of the fire. His chimney would survive. It had to. The morning after the storm began, the world outside John's cabin was unrecognizable. A blanket of snow covered the earth like a shroud, and the trees were bowed under the weight of the wet flakes, their branches scraping against each other in the wind. John could hear the howling of the wind, but it was muffled now, softened by the thick layers of snow that had already piled high against his door. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching in the deep snow, and squinted against the pale light. The mountain air was sharp, biting at his skin, a harsh reminder of just how exposed he was to the elements. But even as the cold nipped at his face, John felt a strange sense of pride. His cabin, standing strong amidst the wilderness, had already proved itself once again. The chimney, still drawing the smoke, upwards with ease, remained untouched by the storm's fury. The fire had never flickered, never faltered. But John was not foolish. He knew this storm was just the beginning. He had seen the signs, the dark clouds gathering, the thick winds that had come without warning. This wasn't just a typical mountain blizzard, this was something far worse. It was the kind of storm that could break a man if he wasn't prepared. The old trappers spoke in hushed tones about blizzards that lasted for days, even weeks, and could freeze a man to death before he even realized it. John had never experienced one that bad, but he knew it was only a matter of time. He checked his supplies. Firewood stacked high near the door, fresh pelts drying by the hearth, and enough food to last him through the storm. But in the back of his mind, he knew that survival wasn't just about provisions. It was about having the right kind of shelter and, more importantly, the right kind of protection. His chimney, built of thick stone and carefully constructed flues, was more than just a way to keep the fire alive. It was his lifeline. No man could endure a storm like this for long without the warmth of a proper fire. And the chimney he'd designed, one unlike any other in these parts, was built to stand up to whatever nature could throw at it. Still, a part of him wondered, had he overestimated its strength? Could even his chimney survive a blizzard like this? As the wind continued to whip through the trees, John made his way back inside, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the storm and the decisions he had made. But he knew one thing for certain. If he was going to survive this, his chimney would have to do its job no matter what. John had spent years building his life in the wilderness, yet nothing in his world was more important than his cabin. The walls were solid logs, hand-picked and shaped, and the roof was tightly covered with thick layers of sod. But it wasn't the physical structure alone that made his cabin different from the others. It was his chimney, an impossible creation, some would say, but to John it was a necessity. The old cabins, the ones the other trappers had built, were simple affairs. A few notched logs, a dirt floor, and maybe a stove or two to keep the cold at bay. But John wasn't like most of the men who roamed the Rockies chasing furs and fortune. He had never been content with the bare minimum. Even after all these years in the mountains, after all the losses and near-death encounters, he still believed in making life just a little bit better. To do that, he needed a cabin that would endure. John's cabin had been built not just for comfort but for survival. He had learned early that the wilderness was unforgiving, especially when the snows came. He had spent the better part of his first winter here, huddled by a fire that sputtered and smoked, barely able to push away the chill in the air. But that night, as he sat, next to the fire, staring into the glowing embers, he knew something had to change. His cabin had to be more than just a shelter from the wind. It had to be a fortress, capable of withstanding the fiercest storms. But to do that, it needed the right kind of heat. In the months that followed, John began studying the architecture of the old European chimneys. He was no engineer, no carpenter trained in formal techniques. But what he lacked in training, he made up for with determination. Every evening, after a long day in the cold, he would pull out his journals, sketches, and notes, piecing together what he had learned. He wasn't looking to invent something new. He was trying to solve a problem that had cost too many men their lives. Most cabins in the Rockies had simple stone chimneys, if they had one at all. John, however, took it further. He built his chimney with the idea that it would withstand the bitterest of winds and the heaviest of snows. He dug deep into the earth, laying the foundation with care. Stone, iron, and thick clay materials that were often dismissed as too cumbersome became his building blocks. The result wasn't just functional, it was an unspoken statement. His chimney wasn't just to carry smoke out of his cabin, it was to fight the elements. Every day, as he worked on his project, John grew more and more obsessed with the idea of making it perfect. His hands, once calloused from years of trapping, grew even rougher as he worked tirelessly to craft the chimney he believed would make the difference. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was his biggest yet. John's first winter in the cabin had been a harsh one. Snow had fallen early that year, and by the time the leaves had turned, the temperatures were already dipping below freezing. Most of the trappers he knew had simply built crude fireplaces inside their cabins. They were functional enough to get by, but they left the men vulnerable when the weather turned truly unforgiving. John couldn't afford to take that risk. He needed something better. His chimney design was a radical departure from what anyone else had tried in these parts. Instead of a simple flue or stone stack, John had crafted a robust system that made the most of the resources at his disposal. He had learned from the masters the old European designs that used thick stone walls and efficient draft systems to keep fires roaring even in the worst of weather. What most men didn't know was that these chimneys weren't just about venting smoke, they were designed to handle the constant push and pull of the elements. They had to work in both blistering heat and numbing cold. John's design was built for endurance. He carefully shaped each stone, carving out every crevice, ensuring that each piece fit together perfectly. But it wasn't just about precision. It was about creating a chimney that would draw heat from every last ember, no matter how cold the wind became. As he worked, He realized that if his chimney was going to survive the kind of storms he was certain would come, it needed to withstand both the weight of the snow and the extreme cold that froze men's bones. He knew that if the chimney didn't function properly in the dead of winter, it would turn his cabin into a death trap. The challenge wasn't just to make sure the chimney was functional, but to make it last. The wind could howl and the snow could pile up, but he needed a chimney that could keep the fire going even when everything else outside was frozen. He had seen too many men lose their fires in the middle of the night because their chimneys couldn't draw the smoke. He had seen the blizzards that froze entire camps, the men huddled around fires that barely warmed them. John didn't want to be one of them. He began experimenting with materials he had never considered before: iron brackets to reinforce the structure, clay to line the walls, and an innovative vent system that allowed for more efficient airflow. Every night, after working his traps, he would return to the cabin, his hands cold and numb, but his mind alight with ideas. It was in the quiet moments, when the wind was still and the stars were the only light, that he would step back and admire his work, convinced that this was the one thing he had gotten right. He was building something that could save his life. The chimney would be more than just a luxury. It would be his lifeline, a testament to his ingenuity and refusal to accept anything less than survival. When the first snowstorm hit that fall, John watched through the small window, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it was only a matter of time before the worst came. But with his chimney drawing the smoke high into the air and the fire blazing strong, he felt a rare sense of confidence. The mountain had sent its challenge, and he had answered with something no one else believed possible. The storm raged for days. Winds howled through the trees like the growl of some beast, and snow piled higher, suffocating the land beneath a blanket of white. John McCallister had seen many storms in his years as a mountain man, but this one was different. It felt like nature itself had turned against him, determined to test his resolve. Each gust of wind that struck his cabin seemed to scream with the weight of its fury, but inside, the warmth of the fire from his chimney fought back against the chill with all its might. John sat by the hearth, the light from the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. He had stoked the fire earlier, and the crackling heat was a welcome relief, though the steady hum of the wind outside kept his mind alert. For a moment he felt the old fear, the fear he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until now. What if his chimney wasn't enough? What if, despite all the work he had poured into it, the storm would break through? He knew the blizzards of the Rockies could be brutal, unpredictable. If it could make the strong falter, it could certainly destroy what one man had built. Outside, the wind picked up once more, and John listened to the rhythmic sound of snow thudding against the cabin walls. The night seemed endless, the storm relentless. But inside, the fire burned, the chimney holding strong. Each gust of wind that howled through the cracks of the cabin seemed to make the cabin itself groan. Yet the chimney, his creation, stood unaffected. John looked at the stone chimney standing tall beside the hearth, the warmth it drew, keeping the cabin at a comfortable temperature. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about testing what he had created. He had built this chimney to endure the worst that the mountain could throw at him. The storm was a test, and it wasn't just nature that was watching. It was John himself. Could he trust that his work would hold up, or would it all come crashing down? As the night wore on, the storm did its worst, but the chimney remained untouched. The heat continued to pour from the hearth, the smoke drawing up and out, its path clean and clear. John sat in silence, watching the fire burn. With each passing hour, his doubt seemed to wane, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. At the peak of the storm, when the wind was its strongest and the snow seemed to fall without end, John stepped to the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Outside, the world was a blur of white. But inside, he could feel the warmth radiating from the fire. The chimney had passed the test. He hadn't just survived the storm, he had built something that would endure, something that could stand up to whatever nature threw at him. The following morning, the storm showed no signs of letting up. John had slept little, his mind too consumed by thoughts of the blizzard's strength. The wind continued to howl outside, and when he opened the door to check the conditions, the cold bit deep into his bones. The snow had piled high against the cabin, almost to the level of the porch. There was a bitter, suffocating stillness in the air, and for the first time, John allowed himself to consider what might happen if the storm didn't let up. As he trudged back inside, he noticed a subtle shift in the temperature. The fire in the hearth was still burning strong, the chimney still drawing the smoke up and away, but the outside cold seemed to be creeping into the cabin. The warmth in the room wasn't as steady as it had been the night before. The storm was closing in tighter, pushing against his cabin as though trying to claim it for itself. John leaned over the fire, watching the flames dance. Despite his fear, despite the creeping doubt, he knew one thing for certain: the chimney had performed flawlessly. It was his cabin, the walls, the door, that were now at risk. The weight of the snow on the roof, combined with the intensity of the wind, could bring it all down. The chimney could handle the fire. It had done its job. But could the structure around it withstand the storm? He had prepared as best as he could, stacked firewood near the door, gathered extra food, and set up his gear to withstand days of isolation. But there was something about this storm that felt different. It wasn't just about surviving the night. It was about holding on to the hope that he could make it through to the other side, and that the chimney he had built would continue to serve him. The cold seemed to be inching closer, despite the fire. John knelt beside the hearth, watching the blaze as it crackled, but his eyes constantly flicked back to the roof. The weight of the snow could be enough to collapse the structure. If the roof buckled, the chimney could easily fail, and everything he had worked for would be lost in an instant. He checked the cabin again, looking over the logs, the windows, the chimney as the wind howled louder. His mind raced. Was the chimney enough? Was his cabin enough? He knew that the storm could last for days, even weeks, and there were only so many things he could control. In this wild, untamed land, nature could strike without warning, without mercy. John knew what was at stake. The chimney was his lifeline, but now it was more than just a question of warmth. It was about survival, and in the desperate hour that stretched ahead of him, it would take more than an impossible chimney to endure the full force of this blizzard. It would take everything he had: strength, will, and an unwavering trust in his work. The storm continued to rage outside, the howling winds and swirling snow making it seem as though the mountain was alive and angry. John stepped back from the fire, the warmth of the cabin now seeming fragile against the overwhelming cold outside. He couldn't control the storm, but he could trust the chimney. It was his creation, and it had withstood the worst so far. The blizzard raged for days, its fury unrelenting. The wind whipped through the trees, and the snow seemed to fall in sheets, completely obscuring the world outside. John McCallister could hear the storm's howls reverberating through the trees, its shrieking voices tugging at his thoughts. But inside, his cabin was a different world, one of warmth, light, and safety. The fire still burned strong, its glow casting flickering shadows across the room. The chimney, which John had spent months designing, continued to work as he had hoped. It drew the smoke high, leaving the air clear and fresh. For the first time in days, John allowed himself to relax. The storm outside was fierce, but inside, his hearth was steady. He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. As the wind howled louder and the snow piled higher against the walls, John stared into the fire. The storm had not let up, but somehow the cabin remained unscathed. His chimney had passed the test. It was drawing heat from the fire without hesitation, the smoke rising in a steady, clean flow. There was no sputtering, no freezing cold air creeping through the cracks. He had created something that worked, and it had proven itself in the heart of this relentless storm. Outside, the world was a swirl of white, the snow drifting like a blanket over the landscape. The mountains seemed to be trying to swallow the world whole, and yet, inside his cabin, John sat in quiet triumph. He had faced nature's fury and had built something that could withstand it. The warmth of the fire filled the room, keeping the cold at bay. For the first time in years, he felt a rare sense of peace, not because the storm had passed, but because he had built something that would keep him safe. John looked at the chimney again. It was as solid as the day he had built it, unbothered by the wind's screams or the weight of the snow. He had crafted it with care, knowing that his life depended on it. Now, it was holding its own, giving him the warmth he needed to survive. The hours passed quietly as the storm continued its attack on the world outside. John didn't sleep much, his mind always alert, always listening for any signs of trouble. But as he sat by the fire, he allowed himself to trust his work. The chimney had held firm, and for the first time in days, he felt the weight of his worries lighten. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. The storm could rage all it wanted. John had built a refuge that even the fiercest weather couldn't touch. The storm finally began to ease on the third day. The wind had lost some of its bite, and the snowfall slowed to a soft, steady fall. John stood at the window, watching as the world outside began to reveal itself once again. The trees were draped in a heavy coat of snow, their branches weighed down like old bone. The mountains seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, as if the storm had passed and nature was taking a breath before the next assault. John opened the door to the cabin, feeling the stillness of the air as he stepped outside. The snow crunched under his boots, and the cold pressed against him like an old friend. The storm had taken its toll, but John had made it through, and so had his chimney. He smiled faintly as he looked back at the cabin. The chimney, still standing strong, had performed exactly as he had hoped. There was no damage, no sign of weakness. His creation had withstood the worst of the blizzard, and now, as the storm tapered off, John allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. It wasn't just the warmth that had kept him going. It was the knowledge that he had done something few others could. The storm had tested him, but more importantly, it had tested his design. And the result was undeniable. His chimney had held up. The fire had burned hot and steady, and the smoke had drawn perfectly, never once faltering. John walked around the cabin, checking the roof and the walls for any signs of damage. He knew that the snow had built up around the foundation, but everything seemed intact. The chimney had done its job. It had kept the fire going, kept the cabin warm, and, most importantly, it had kept him alive. For the first time in what felt like weeks, John allowed himself to sit back and rest. He returned to his small table, pulling a chair out and sitting near the hearth. The fire was still burning, but now it was a quiet companion, the flames no longer battling the storm outside but instead simply providing a steady warmth like an old friend. John stared into the flames, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. This storm, this test, had proven something. His chimney wasn't just a good idea, it was a lifeline. It was proof that, in the face of nature's most brutal elements, a man could survive if he was willing to fight back with more than just strength, if he was willing to use his mind and his hands to build something that could stand up to the mountain itself. As the days passed and the storm faded into memory, John knew that his work wasn't done. The mountain was still as dangerous as ever. The next storm could be just around the corner. But for now, as he sat by the fire and let the warmth seep into his body, he allowed himself to enjoy the quiet victory. His chimney had passed the test, and with it, his life had been saved. For the first time in years, John McCallister felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The storm passed, and as John McCallister stepped outside, the world seemed to breathe again. The once howling wind had quieted, leaving behind a snow-covered landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. The mountain was still, but it had tested him, tested his resolve, his work, and his ability to survive. Yet, as he surveyed the landscape, John knew something had changed within him. This storm had proven what he had always believed, that ingenuity could save a man's life in a way that sheer strength or luck never could. He walked around the cabin, inspecting the walls, the roof, and the chimney. Everything was intact, no sign of weakness anywhere. The chimney, his pride and joy, stood tall and proud beside the hearth. It had done exactly what he had designed it to do. It had withstood the brutal forces of nature and kept him alive. But there was something deeper in the quiet of the aftermath, something that John hadn't yet fully grasped. It wasn't just the survival of the storm that mattered, it was what had come from it. The way he had solved a problem that most men had resigned themselves to. The way he had approached the land with practical intelligence and unwavering perseverance. The storm had tested his work, but it had also proven that his ingenuity had created something far more than a simple structure. John's cabin, his chimney, had become a beacon of hope for others who might find themselves in the same deadly situation. He had built it not just for himself, but for anyone who needed shelter from the relentless storms of the Rockies. The men who traveled the mountains knew the dangers: grizzlies, freezing cold, starvation, but now John's creation would be a shield against the winter's fury. In the days that followed, word of his cabin spread. Trappers, travelers, and other mountain men began stopping by, asking questions, marveling at the chimney and its efficiency. They wanted to know how he had built it, how it worked, and whether it could save them from the worst of the weather. John shared his knowledge freely, not out of pride, but because he understood the importance of survival. It wasn't just about keeping himself warm, it was about passing on the knowledge that had saved him. As the seasons passed, more and more men adopted John's design. His chimney, once a solitary invention, became a standard among those who valued life over speed. The story of John McCallister's chimney spread far beyond the mountain trails. The mountain men began calling it the McCallister method, and it wasn't just a name, it was a legacy of survival, of perseverance, and of ingenuity in the face of nature's harshest trials. For John, the legacy was something far quieter. There was no fanfare, no celebration of his genius. But every time he walked past the hearth, every time he sat by the fire, he knew that his work had made a difference, and that was enough. The days turned to weeks, and the weeks stretched into months. The storm that had tested John McCallister's resolve now seemed like a distant memory, but the lessons he had learned from it remained with him. His chimney had done more than survive the storm. It had become a testament to the power of innovation, to the quiet strength that could be found in the simplest of solutions. Over time, John's work became known throughout the mountain men's camps. Those who had heard of the McCallister method began seeking him out, wanting to learn how to build their own chimneys, how to survive the winters with the same unwavering confidence that John had shown. John never sought recognition for his creation. He didn't ask for anything in return. He simply passed on his knowledge, knowing that what he had built wasn't just about a chimney, it was about survival in the most unforgiving environment. One spring, several years after the blizzard of '59, John found himself in town, selling his furs at the trading post. The snow had melted, and the warmth of the sun felt like a distant memory of the harsh months. But the stories of the storm, and the chimney that had withstood it, still circulated among the men who had passed through. John overheard a group of young trappers talking in the corner of the post. "Old McCallister," one of them said, his voice laced with awe. "They say he built a chimney that never froze, even in the worst blizzards. Ain't nobody knows how he did it, but it worked. I heard it saved his life." John smiled softly to himself as he listened to the tale. The stories had grown with each telling, as stories often did, but the truth was there. His chimney had saved his life and the lives of others. It had become more than just a functional tool. It had become a symbol of resilience, of the power of innovation in the face of adversity. John never made a fortune from his invention. He never sought fame or recognition. He returned to his small cabin, far from the noise and bustle of civilization, where he spent his days in solitude, trapping and living off the land. But the legacy of his chimney remained, scattered across the mountains like a trail of survival, a quiet testament to a man who had made the impossible possible. Years passed, and new generations of trappers and settlers moved through the mountain passes. They found their way to the same cabins, the same shelter that had once saved John McCallister's life. Many of them, unknowingly, used the same techniques he had perfected: the chimney that never froze, the design that had become a standard of survival. When John passed away in 1871, he was buried quietly in a small cemetery in Oregon. His gravestone made no mention of the man he had been, the survivalist who had built something that had stood the test of time. But in the mountains, his legacy endured, not written in books or carved in stone, but etched into the very foundations of the cabins that had kept men alive. John McCallister had shown that the most important inventions weren't always the ones that changed the world overnight. Sometimes, the greatest innovations were the ones that made survival possible even in the harshest of conditions, and in that, his legacy lived on.